Hey everyone, it's Press Any Button. Welcome back to another tutorial in the Run and Gun series. Hopefully we're going to have a short part. It's just going to be going over how we set up our melee character. As you saw in the demonstration, our character is going to hit our player at close range. They're going to take away that health, and also we're going to apply a force upon our player to show that we've actually been hit, just as a little bit of a feedback to our player. Without any further delay, let's just jump straight into it. The theme of this video is pretty much just the shooting attack type with a couple of edits. There wasn't any reason why we should do anything super new when the formula that we've already got works pretty well. So I've got my melee pursuit. We set up the animations last part, and you can see that I have a hit animation up and ready. So we won't really talk about animations in this part. I'm gonna set it back to idle, but we are going to talk about how you set up this character. So the first two things that you're going to do is you're going to right click and hit create empty. Now when you hit create empty, you're going to make that empty game object a child of your character right here, of your melee character. And once they are a child of your melee character, make sure you edit their name and call them hit spawn. You're going to leave that empty game object just as it is. You're going to do the same, so right click, create empty, and then make it a child, and then you're going to go melee check, and it's just the same. It's an empty game object, we're not going to add any components to it. Now with your melee check, you're going to want the transforms to be reset completely. And then with your hit spawn, you're going to want it to be a little bit in front of your character here. So if I can get the gizmos up, you can see that my hit spawn is just a little bit in front of my character there. This is because my character has an actual collider, so my player can't really get much closer than that unless I shrink the size of the collider, but I like where the collider's at because it works well with the spacing and the way that the character actually interacts with the environment. So we've set up those two things, and we just want to do one final thing. We're going to right click, we're going to create empty, and this time we're going to add a component, and that component is going to be a circle collider 2D. Going to set that to is trigger, which means that we can go straight through it, and then we're going to just leave that as it is. I'll show you an example of a prefab that I have right here. You can see that I have my little prefab there. Where are you? Well, you can't really see him. He's like John Cena. So I'm going to put the gizmos on, and there you are. You can see my little game object. So when we toggle the gizmos here, you can actually see what's happening behind the scenes. And just as we had before, it's a circle collider, is trigger, we don't want a rigid body or anything like that. Then we're going to go add component, new script, and you're going to create a script and call it enemy hit. I'm going to see you guys in Visual Studio. Alright, so we've just created the enemy hit script. What are we actually going to do with it? Well, it's very simple. I want you to go over to your player destruction script, and I want you to just copy and paste literally everything from that script except from where it says public class player destruction, because you're going to get a slew of issues if you do that. So just what's after the first bracket or the first bracket and everything, but just make sure it matches up correctly. So once you've done that, you'll have something that looks similar to this. Now I have a little bit of a difference here, and that is the fact that I have a void start function. And in void start, I say destroy the game object after 1 second. So this is the script that we attach to our game objects that we want to hurt our player. So of course, enemy hit is a game object that we're going to use to hurt our player. We set the collider to is trigger because we don't want it to push our player, but we want it to enter the other collider of our player. When we instantiate the game object, and we'll get to that in a second. We want it just to have a lifespan of 1 second, or however long we want. And then in void awake, we have a reference set up here. We know we're looking for the player. It's the game object with the tag player. And then we have a reference back to that player health script. So everything is intact from what we've done in player destruction. Void on trigger, just a reminder, if the other game object is that player game object, the game object that is tagged player, then our player is going to take damage and we're going to destroy the game object that this is attached to, which is the enemy hit. So our enemy hit gets destroyed in 2 ways. It either stays in the scene for a second, or it makes contact with our player and goes. Either way, we don't want this thing to stick around. So we've established the damage for our player, and that's literally it. We're not going to make this like a shot. It's not going to move or anything, so we can leave that game object just like that and it will be fine. But how are we going to make it so that our enemy actually instantiates this object so that this damage is dealt and so that we have a little bit of feedback from our player? Let's first go back to our melee dynamic tracking. If you're comparing this with your script from last time, you'll see that there's a lot of changes here. So I'm just going to highlight the parts that we've actually changed. At the start here, we have a bunch of references to a bunch of variables and things that we're going to use in a little bit. Where did we get this all from? Well, we can go over to a different script because we're just reusing stuff, and that is our enemy behavior script. Now at the top of our enemy behavior script, we have all of those same pieces, and you're just going to take that second line if you've done it exactly as I've done it. But if you haven't, we're just focusing on excluding the reference to the animator. So take the second line and highlight everything, go back to your melee dynamic and paste it in. Now, where are we going to use these things? Void awake, we're not going to touch that, everything's good. But we're going to go under that flip function and we're going to paste in an if statement. Go back to our enemy behavior and we have in void update this if statement right here that we're going to copy and paste just like that. So I have this if statement right there, and you're going to have the names flipped around a little bit. So I'll just explain where those changes take place. So our ball is actually alert originally, but now it's melee because of course. Where it says fire, I've just replaced it with hit because it just makes a lot more sense in my head and I know what I'm working with in that way. And where it will say anim.setBall alert, you want to change that to melee. That's really the only part that is going to have a consequence when we're back in Unity when we change it to melee, because that's going to be the parameter that you set up. You don't want your parameter to say alert because we're going to use that for a different thing potentially. And even if we don't, it just makes more sense to have melee as your parameter name instead of alert. It's just relevant. So hopefully you can see where most of these pieces are being used. In our if statement, it's just a basic fire rate thing. So we have a fire rate and it's going to instantiate a game object, which is going to be a public game object, so something we can drag in, which is going to be our enemy hit. So that's what we're going to drag into that inspector slot. And that game object is going to be instantiated at a certain position and a certain rotation, and that is going to be our hit spawn, which we're going to drag in that empty game object that we made before. Now when we made an alert state for our long-ranged enemy, we used physics 2D.overlap circle. We used that to make an alert state and we used it at quite a range. This time round, we're just going to use it quite close to our enemy game object so that they're only going to enter this state when our player is virtually like on top of them, and not like on top of them because I know that can happen, but right next to them. How are we going to do that? Well, we go back to enemy behavior and where it says void fixed update, we just take all of that and just literally paste it as it is, void fixed update included. You just paste that in there. Change the names around if you have, so melee is going to be alert, and then melee check, melee radius, melee identifier. So this is the layer mask. This is the public transform melee check, and we're going to drag our melee check in there. And then the radius is also going to be a public float, which we can manipulate later in the inspector. Once that overlap occurs, and that overlap is going to be checking, once that overlap occurs, and it will know that we've overlapped with the desired game object, because it will be a game object in the layer player, which is a layer that we're going to either set up now if you haven't already got it, which you should do, or we'll just use. And then we've got anim.setBall, melee, melee. And that's pretty much it. So that's the bulk of what we've got here. And at this point, you can really just sort of end your bit if you're not too bothered about having our character move a little bit, get sprung up into the air. But if you do want to see how that works, follow me over to your player movement script. Now in our player movement script, I've made quite a simple edit, and it's just a void on trigger enter situation here. It's very similar to what we've used before with our spring for our melee dynamic tracking. And that's just to say again, we are recycling what we already know, making good use of it and applying it in the best ways. If there is something new that we need to pick up, then we're going to pick it up. But right now we're just going to milk everything for what it's got. So I say that if there's a game object with the tag enemy hit, then we're going to get the rigid body of our player game object and add a force of 600 going up and break. And that's pretty much it. So how do we set this all up? Well, let's go back into Unity and do that. Alright, so if you've set up your script like me, you can go back to your melee pursuit character and drag those little bits over. So where you have your melee check, you'll want to drag that into there. Where you have your hit spawn, you drag that into there. Where you've made the game object enemy hit, you'll drag that into there. I called mine hitbox, but you can call it enemy hit or whatever. All acts the same, and you don't need that little dot that I have there. But if you do want to use that, it's just in the drop down here on the inspector. Gives you a good visual of what's happening when you open up the gizmos. We're going to set our melee identifier to player. If you don't have that already, you can go over to your player or any game object really, and then go down the layer option here and go to add layer. Once you've added your new layer, hit enter and it'll be available on the drop down. And you want your tag to be player for your player game object. And one thing that I actually neglected, on your enemy hit, make sure it's a prefab by dragging it down into your folder over here if you haven't already. You'll also want to have the tag enemy hit, exactly as we did it in the script. If you don't have that, again, just go to add tag, and in this instance you just gotta hit that little plus icon there, type your tag and then save it. Right, there is something else that I did neglect, and that was that our enemy actually has speed this time, because before their speed was variable. The closer that they would get to our player game object, the slower they would get, to a certain point where they would almost come to a stop, and that wasn't something that I wanted, because it just seems a little bit pedestrian for an enemy that likes to run up to us and punch us. Well, let's go back into Visual Studio, and then we're going to go to our melee dynamic tracking script. And I've made a super simple change here. So I've made a new public float, and I've called that enemy speed up here, and I've set it to 5 by default. 2 I found is a pretty good speed for what I'm working with. And then where it says move direction X, it's just going to have that comma there. But instead we're going to have enemy speed. We're going to have that float in there. So it's going to multiply move direction X by enemy speed. So it's going to go by a speed of 2 in direction X. And that is literally all we got to worry about. Make sure you save your changes, return to Unity and get everything set up down here. Another recommendation of mine is that you set the melee radius to 1 and the hit rate to 1 if you're working with what I'm working with, if you've got the project right now, with the intent of making sure that the hit rate kind of matches up with the hit animation. Speaking of animations, we're going to go to the animator window and you're going to have all of your little bits detached. So say this was my melee run, it would be just floating out in space. But the first thing we'll do is we'll set up that new parameter. So you hit that plus icon, it's going to be a ball, you call it melee, same as you did in the script. And then we're going to right click on here, make a transition over to there. And in our transition, we're going to use that new condition melee. And we say, if it's true, we're going to switch to that animation. And then if it's false, we're going to switch back. Now, with the true part, we're going to have has exit time unchecked. But when it's false, we're going to have has exit time checked. Just so our player's not too snappy with the animation. We want this animation to run through all the way before they go back to any other frames of animation. Right, that's from our idle animation to our hitting animation. For our idle to our run, we want to do essentially the same thing, true, and then false, has exit time is still checked, and we don't have to touch anything else because these things we've set up prior. So these are the only little bits that we're going to be messing around with in this part. So now I'm going to do the outro with the demonstration. We get rid of that prefab in our scene because once that goes, it all goes, and then you get tons of errors like these and they worry you for no reason. Anyway guys, that is it for our tutorial. Hope you enjoyed what we've been able to accomplish here. So we've set up a melee character who's able to destroy our character at close range. Maybe you want to give them big damage because they have to run up to you and all that. However, that will be up to you. For now, this is Press Any Buttons, signing out with a snappy outro. Press on, keep creating guys. See you next part.